I'd like to introduce you to Sam Punch, who you will have seen earlier today, as she is co-hosting this conference with us. Sam is from the University of Stirling and very much the main force behind the BAMSA project. So, Sam, please go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Samantha Punch and I lead the project Bridge a Mind Sport for All, which is BAMSA for short. We're hosted at the University of Stirling in Scotland, but we're an international research programme working with many bridge organisations. And today I'm going to focus on a team project called Bridging Insights. And this is a collaboration between Bridge to Bridge, BAMSA and SHM Productions. So there's co-authors Jordan, Gary, Christina, Esme and Morris. And in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to be talking about a new coaching and training project that BAMSA's recently finished. So the aim of the Bridging Insights project is to inform the development of a marketing strategy to promote the game to the next generation of players. In order to do that, we need to think about how to shift the image of bridge from this to one which has wider appeal, in a similar way to what we've already heard this morning from Matthias in his presentation. We need to think about how to shift this to attract new kinds of players of all ages, those who will play for fun and those who will work at the game and play more seriously. So first of all, a question for you, and perhaps you can put some of your answers to this in the chat. Why do you play bridge? Why did you start playing? But perhaps more importantly, what makes you keep wanting to play? And we looked at 2 BAMSA studies on the motivations of a wide range of players. And from those research findings, we developed 4 key types of players. Each type of player is linked to what drives people to play bridge. And these motivations can be intrinsic, providing internal rewards, or extrinsic motivations, which offer external rewards. So the 4 types, ideal types of bridge players that came out of this research are the socializer, competitor, self-improver, and mind gamer. These aren't fixed categories. People tend to identify much more strongly with 1 or 2 types, so they do overlap. Most people aren't purely one type only, but cross over. And that could be in different contexts. So for example, you might be a socializer playing at home with friends, but then you go off to a tournament and you become more of a competitor. Or it can change over time. Some of our participants said they used to be a clear-cut competitor type, but as they've got older, then winning is perhaps less important and they're now much more of a socializer. So what underpins these player types is their motivations for playing. So think about where might you place yourself in relation to these 4 types. And again, importantly, and this links to what Lynn was just telling us about, what about your students? Do you know how they might categorize themselves? So the self-improver type plays bridge for the challenge of the mind game, which is both serious and internally driven. The competitor type is motivated by the art of the game, which is a serious yet extrinsic endeavor. And the socializer type participates for the fun of the game that's extrinsically social between other people. And the mind gamer type is for the insights of others for their own internal gain. So it might be worth asking those in your bridge lessons about what motivates them to learn, because if you understand their motivations for playing, you can perhaps tailor aspects of the class to these different types, rather than, as Lynn suggested, sometimes we have a tendency to assume a player or a learner is the same type as we are. So I'll very briefly explain the process and the methods behind this project. It was based on qualitative research. As I said, the 4 types emerged from previous BAMSA studies, and you can get more details about how we did this from the short video, Thinking Outside the Box, which is on the previous BAMSA conference YouTube channel. We then held focus groups at that BAMSA conference, and some of you may have participated in that. And we asked the bridge players to flesh out these 4 types and to give observations of what the 4 types look like in the bridge world. And then we took those 4 types to discuss them in focus groups with relatively young non-bridge players to explore their thinking about these 4 types and how that related to attracting them to play bridge or not. And for both sets of focus groups, we used a structured question guide, which was informed by a behavior change framework. So we readily think about differences between learning groups based on demographics. And at this conference, we're going to see many presentations that talk about how we might vary our approach as to whether we've got younger or older older students, for example. We're also probably now all very aware of distinct learning styles. We know people have different preferences for verbal, visual, or active learning, and we try to cater to those preferences in our teaching. But do we regularly consider these 4 types of players based on their motivations for playing? Plus, there'll be a mixture of player types in the same room, as Lynn's just given us lots of examples of many different types of players in the same room, and we might need to think about how to engage them differently. So the implications then of understanding different player types can be relevant for recruitment. That's using different marketing strategies to appeal to different player types. For retention, and that can be both during the learning phase in lessons and then later on playing in clubs. And also later on for organising events and tournaments, bearing in mind how to keep engaging the different types in different ways simultaneously. It can be beneficial to know what drives your students then to play bridge and tap into what appeals to that kind of player. So the socializer and the competitor were the 2 most widely recognised types, and that was by both the bridge community and the non-bridge players. They tend to be quite different in terms of what they like to get out of the game. So the quotes that I'm going to present are from the non-bridge players focus groups, and I'll leave you to read them. So in contrast to the competitor, the socializer distanced themselves from competition, as this quote indicates. So the competitor, socializing is much more likely to take place after the game with post-mortems, whereas a relaxed and friendly atmosphere is important for socializers. Perhaps they might like to have snacks and drinks and be chatting during the game. Socializers and competitors then are the most different of the 4 types, whereas self-improvers can overlap with both of these, but self-improvers perhaps have more in common with competitors, whereas mind gamers can intersect with any of the other 3 types. So the categories are fluid and not fixed. It can depend on who you're playing with at that particular time, or where you might be playing, what context. And as some players then shift between these categories according to these different contexts and over time, but others can be more clearly one type. So there's positive and negative characteristics attached to each player type. And competitors, we know, are driven by the desire to win and compete, and that can be very enjoyable, but it can also be exhausting. So the negative connotations that competitors in our study described included feelings of humiliation and disappointment. Self-improvers enjoy the lifelong learning nature of bridge, but if their progress starts to plateau, that can also be frustrating. So it is important to recognize the downsides of each player type. So then, as teachers or coaches, we can try to find ways to mitigate some of the negatives. For example, it might be possible to find ways to encourage the competitors and the self-improvers to appreciate more of the social elements of the game as a way to alleviate some of the stress. So in the focus groups, the 4 types sparked a discussion about whether bridge should be referred to as a mind game or a mind sport. Bridge is seen to use a lot of mental energy, and as this participant said, there's something appealing about it. There was ambiguity then of whether bridge should be considered a sport or not, which is why some preferred the term mind game rather than mind sport. And this goes back to player types and the purpose of playing bridge, as this quote shows. So interestingly, the bridge community identified less with the mind gamer type, but this wasn't the case for the non-bridge community. And this points perhaps to an untapped area in terms of marketing. Maybe we should be developing a targeted marketing campaign to attract mind gamers, such as those who play esports and other mind sports, video gamers and board gamers. And Milan Matsura mentions this in his presentation, that bridge doesn't yet connect enough with esports and other gaming communities. So some of our research participants associated the mind gamer type as someone interested in the psychological aspects of gameplay, perhaps a bit like Zia, where it involves observing your opponent to find out what goes on in people's minds. So the non-bridge players suggested a greater social media presence, such as on Instagram and TikTok. They felt that this would help to counteract the stigmatized image of bridge and could encourage younger players to learn, as this quote suggests. So a lack of knowledge about the game can hinder its appeal to non-bridge players. For example, another participant said, currently, I just don't know enough about it. So like Iceland, we need to keep finding new ways to educate people about bridge. So the study led to 6 recommendations, each of which should be tailored to the different player types. The first recommendation is about shifting the image of bridge, and we've already heard quite a lot about how Iceland's managing to do that. Both the bridge and the non-bridge community talked about the image problem and the stereotypes, which are barriers that have to be overcome, such as by using influence on social media. Some potential solutions, of course, would be difficult and costly to produce. People often refer to the fact that we need a bridge version of the Queen's Gambit, but that would be very expensive. However, we could use more staged professional photos and short video clips. For example, by showing a diverse range of younger players, that could help to disrupt the traditional image of bridge as an older person's game. And such images and videos could be used on different social media platforms as a part of a targeted marketing campaign aimed at distinct types of gamers and potential bridge players. And while some of this does currently happen, we need more of it. And both Tracy and Sam will talk more about this in their presentations. It's certainly not easy to transform the stereotypical image of bridge, but we do need a greater multi-pronged attack at trying to achieve that. The second recommendation was to use existing research to develop evidence-based resources. For example, there's research on the motivations and social rewards that drive bridge players to compete in international tournaments, and that could be used to create multimedia resources to foster a new image of the game. So we have started to try to develop some resources from BAMSA's existing research, and we plan to do more of that with our next project, which is on youth players and bridge in schools. This video and research animation are early attempts, and we'd like to work collaboratively with bridge organisations to develop more effective resources in the future. So we're looking for more suggestions on what could be useful for you in your work. As teachers, what format, style, or content of resources could be helpful to you? Or how could these kinds of resources be improved? And you can either put ideas in the chat today, or you can email me later. So continuing with the recommendations, the next 2 are particularly relevant for clubs. And I think we're all really aware of the importance of this third recommendation. I'm sure we all know of differences between clubs where some seem to be more friendly than others. But this welcoming approach requires all players in clubs and tournaments to make a big effort in being nice to new and less experienced players. And unfortunately, the competitor player type can forget to be understanding in the heat of battle. But we must remember that one unthoughtful comment can be enough to put off the socializer from returning. So it's all our responsibility to be as welcoming as possible and to encourage others to do so. It also requires players to be more accepting of others and more tolerant. And sometimes bridge players do need a gentle reminder of that, maybe at the start of a session. The fourth recommendation is to strike a balance between these different player types. And non-bridge players expressed a reluctance to take up bridge because of the perception of clubs being too focused on the competitor type. This issue is particularly pertinent with the slow return to face-to-face bridge in some parts of the world. Before the pandemic, some clubs may have run separate sessions for more social or more serious players, but in the new normal, for some of us with lower club numbers, it can be more practical to offer mixed ability games. And this links back then to the third recommendation. Clubs need to ensure that recent learners and socializers are welcomed and enabled to feel comfortable playing alongside the more experienced players and the competitor types. So the fifth recommendation could be achieved by using modified rules when playing bridge in different places, such as a community venue or cafe bridge. It might also involve shorter games where you can drop into play rather than needing to stay for the full 3 hours. It will also require us to be more open to try alternatives. And this might mean that we have to do something that doesn't meet our version of what bridge should be, but it could help to get new players on board with more fun and less serious approaches. And the final recommendation also encourages greater experimentation, but this time with learning approaches. So for example, it might include further integration of technology to analyze hands, or more opportunities to involve more people in pre or post-game discussions. And these then would be aimed more at the self-improver or at the competitor. And Jean-Pierre's presentation gives a great example of how to do this. So these recommendations aren't new in isolation, and others have pointed to the need for bridge to do more of these things. But what perhaps is new is how each of these 6 recommendations could be tailored to the different player types. As teachers and coaches, we will consider how the 4 types of players map onto the students that we teach or mentor. As we've seen, there's quite a big difference between the socializer and the competitor, and it's not always easy to cater for both at the same time. But in many of our lessons, in our clubs, and even in tournaments, we will have a mixture of those different player types, and they will respond differently to teaching and learning practices. So it's worth considering how recruitment and retention strategies can be targeted differently for socializers, competitors, self-improvers, and mind gamers. If you'd like to know more about this Bridging Insights study, a full report and a summary is available on the BAMSA website, and links to these are on this conference website. So now I'd like to tell you about a follow-on research project, which has been in partnership between BAMSA and the Scottish Bridge Union. We looked at different countries' experiences of training and developing the competitor type. So the competitor type in this sense is the ones who go on to represent their country in international and junior events. 28 national bridge organisations from around the world took part in this research, and that included small, medium and larger NBOs. So the aim then of this project was to explore what works well when training junior and international players, and the difficulties and solutions that are faced by different countries. So this research includes a report on the roles of captains and coaches, and it also includes a player survey on their experiences of training and development. The series of reports are designed to enable NBOs, coaches and players to reflect on best practice in relation to the training, support and development of international players. So we hope some of you will find it useful to see what other countries do to transition new young players to national youth teams, and then transition juniors to represent their country as adults in various categories, open, women's or mixed categories. Obviously, what you really want is that the young competitor type is also a self-improver who's committed to their own development. Then as a coach, you just have to point them in the right direction in terms of which books to read. You can offer them some bridge problems and exercises, and they'll work through those both individually and perhaps also in their partnership. This will appeal very much to the self-improvers, but you might have to work much harder to encourage some of the other types to have that self-discipline to work on their game away from the table. As Alan Shillito says in the England case study, you cannot beat individual hard work for progress. So motivating them to want to study is a key step. So as he says, my job is about getting them hooked. All these reports and summaries can be found in the Bridging Organisations project in the research area of the BAMSA website. So just to give a quick flavour of what the coaches report covers, it's based on the views of some top coaches such as England's David Byrne and the late Eric Kokish, who coached the famous Nickel team in the USA. It also includes other top players who have had roles as coaches and team captains, giving their views on each of these topics listed here. And we have a similar report then on what makes a good non-playing captain, and that's from the perspective of both the NPCs as well as players who have been captained by them. And I'm just going to end the talk with a very brief update on BAMSA's work. Recent publications include papers such as the physical aspects of mind sport, couples sharing their passion for bridge together. And as we heard from Lynn, it's not always a harmonious experience, but it can be fun as well as involving fights and failures. And we also have another recent paper on emotions, which links to Arne's talk and her presentation that we'll soon be hearing. So the resources area of the BAMSA website has all these papers, including a 2-page accessible summary on each academic article. And we're also open to producing other kinds of resources from these academic papers that would be more accessible and useful to the bridge world. I'm currently supervising a master's thesis by Abby McCutcheon, and she's exploring various strategies of mind sport promotion. And that includes comparing what we do in the bridge world to what happens in other mind sports, such as chess and poker. And a report on this will be available early in the new year. And our next study, which is starting very soon, is looking at how to get bridge into more schools in various countries and how to develop mind sport education. And you can find out more about BAMSA's work by subscribing to our newsletter via the BAMSA website or by following us on social media. We'd also encourage you today to, if you are a tweeter, to tweet or put things on Facebook about this conference to get more interest, because hopefully others will be interested in these presentations. And these last few slides just have the links to all the reports and audiovisual resources that I've mentioned in this presentation. These links can also be found in a resources list on the conference website. And we would ask that if you use any of these resources, it's really helpful for BAMSA if you could email us to let us know how you've used them. That's very helpful to enable us to keep making resources that are useful and applicable to practitioners like yourselves. And finally, these are the 4 BAMSA research projects which have been relevant to this presentation. You can find more about that in the research area of the BAMSA website. Thank you, and we look forward to any comments or feedback.
Great presentation, Sam. I've got some questions for you. Could you tell me, when you were doing your research, what was the thing that surprised you most? Because we all have expectations, but something jumps out and you thought, well, that's amazing. I never thought it would be like that.
Well, amazing might be a stretch too far, but I mean, I suppose one thing that surprised me is that the bridge world wasn't as clued up about this term mind gamer, whereas it's a very common word or term outside our bridge world. And I do think that points to why we're missing a trick in terms of marketing to this group, you know, marketing to other mind sport players, to video gamers, to the gaming community. And there is more work happening in this area. There's now a Discord community, and people are streaming more, and there's more engagement with the kind of wider gaming world. But I think we should be doing much more of that, and we need many more suggestions about how we might go about that.
The next question I've got is, when you interview people, do you think they're always honest when they assess themselves?
I mean, that is a common issue in doing research. If you think of yourself, if someone asks you what time you get up every day, you'll give the idealistic answer. You might not always, you know, mention the times where you're getting up much later. So you'll focus on your ideal representation of how you think you'd like to be. And that's a key issue in interviews. If you're only doing your methods based on interviews only, then you have to accept that it's not necessarily about being honest or not, but people sometimes over-exaggerate a certain version of themselves. And that's why we always combine our methods with other methods. And that's why we used focus groups with both bridge players and non-bridge players who talked about how other bridge players had assessed themselves, so that we developed the 4 types of players over quite a long process of using multiple methods together.
Okay, and the next one that was sent to me is, what's the hardest part of getting information?
Well, for this particular project, it was trying to recruit the non-bridge players. I mean, if you can imagine how hard we all struggle trying to recruit bridge players to play bridge, try recruiting non-bridge players to play bridge, try recruiting non-bridge players to participate in bridge research. That was a big challenge, but we got there in the end, but it was a long process.